Thank you, everyone, for this warm welcome. It is my pleasure to be here in England for the first time in my life. And thank you so much. Yeah, all right. And I heard it was an international city, but I did not realize how international it was. It's great. All right. Now let me make my radical case for open borders. Many people said we talk about recent events. No, this is a long-term plan. Recent events in no way impact it. All right, well, slightly, but do not impact the intellectual argument, and that is what we're concerned with today at the Think Conference. So, just to start, the world is very far from open borders. I have often heard people say, under the open borders policies of the last 30 years, and I'm thinking, what are you talking about? They're not open borders policies. What country has open borders? I can't think of a single one that does. You have some countries that have open borders with other countries, but no country has open borders with all countries, which is, of course, what open borders is really about. Now, unlike almost everyone who is accused of favoring open borders, I actually do favor open borders. What is open borders? Quick version. If you don't belong in jail, then you are free to live and work in any country on earth. So obviously, if you belong behind bars for murder, then open borders does not mean you get to leave jail. But otherwise, if you are not properly in jail, you are free to live and work in any country on earth. How far is the status quo from such a world? Very. This is clear from several different kinds of evidence. First of all, the letter of the law. So in the United States, it is extremely hard for any low-skilled worker to ever move to the United States, ever, unless they have a close blood relative already in the United States. And of course, most low-skilled people on earth do not. For higher-skilled workers, it is not as hard, but if you talk to anyone in the United States who tries to do it, or especially those who are not in the United States yet, it is very difficult to get in. Really, your big hopes, if you marry a U.S. citizen, you can get in. If you are the minor child of a U.S. citizen, you can get in. And if you can prove that you are an immigrant of exceptional talent, which really is, if not Nobel Prize-winning material, then in that general ballpark. So it is actually very hard to get in. The United States is very far from open borders, and everything I know about the UK says that it, too, is very far from open borders as well. You can also see this in black market prices. In general, people do not pay large amounts of money to do things they can do for free. The black market price of getting smuggled in from Mexico to the United States is about $4,000 a year. For a rural Mexican farm worker, the main demographic that would be interested in getting smuggled into the United States, that's about 3 years' worth of labor. So my dad, who is one of the angriest critics of immigration that I know, fond of telling me, oh, the border is completely open. Well, how about we put you on the other side and see how hard it is for you to get back without your passport? It actually is very difficult and would cost a lot of money, which to my dad wouldn't be so much. But to someone who is a rural Mexican farm worker, it is an enormous sacrifice, and especially when you realize that you only have about a 50-50 chance of getting in. So you're paying several years' worth of income for a 50-50 shot of getting in. Right, so, and the black market price in Mexico is, of course, the very lowest, cheapest price for getting in. If you want to get smuggled in from, say, India, that's more like $50,000. So you get an idea about how hard it really is, measured by the fact that people really do pay these amounts to a smuggler to get them in, because it is actually extremely difficult. Finally, there have been surveys of migration preferences finding that many hundreds of millions of people on Earth say that they would like to permanently move to another country. Right? And that is probably, in the short run, an overstatement because people will not move right away. But on the other hand, in the longer run, is likely to be an understatement because many people don't want to be the first person from their country to move to another country. But once you already have some family there, then, as you may have noticed, people then say, well, now that I got family, now I'll move. All right, so under open borders, hundreds of millions would move, though not overnight. Now, often when I talk about this, people act as if the very fact that hundreds of millions of people would move is the reason to not have open borders. No, in my mind, that is the reason to have open borders. So right now, there is so much talent that is being wasted in other countries, and people would actually take advantage of the opportunity to have a better life. If all that open borders did was say it's now legal to move and no one said they wanted to, then it would be interesting in a sense, but not worth having a big talk on. All right, now why would it not happen overnight? The short-run reason is there are bottlenecks, so things like it would be hard to build the housing for that many people that quickly. The jobs would not be there right away. Even the transportation, there wouldn't be enough transportation to move 100 million people in a month. Right? So even if you had every single boat, every single plane. But that's the kind of thing that would be worked out over the course of some years. Second, deeper reason why you would not expect it to move overnight is something called diaspora dynamics. So we look at the way that immigration works. Normally, when immigration is first legalized, it does not lead to an instant flood of people. Instead, you see a trickle at first, which then makes it seem like people didn't really want to come. But once there's a trickle, then there are other people from the country that sent the trickle that says, well, now there's a few people from my country there. Now that looks a little bit better to me. And once there's more, then it snowballs. A great example of this is Puerto Rico. There was a 1902 Supreme Court case that made Puerto Rico have open borders with the United States. And in the first 10 years, only a few thousand Puerto Ricans moved, which might lead you to think Puerto Ricans just don't like America. But what actually happened is in the next decade, there were about 10, 20,000 that moved. Next decade after that, another 25,000. And pretty soon, or after 100 years, over half of all Puerto Ricans live in the United States. So it did take a long time. And you can even see this at the level of different states. Like initially, Puerto Ricans went not to Florida, but to New York, right? Which might seem weird, but they would rather live near other Puerto Ricans in cold weather than not near Puerto Ricans in warm weather. Right, now, how would open borders change the world? So first big effect, which overwhelms all others, a massive increase in global production. So when economists have tried to estimate what would happen if anyone could take a job anywhere, anyone could move to any place on Earth where they wanted to live and work, standard estimate is that global GDP would roughly double. So no, this is the GDP of the world. The total output of the world would roughly double. This is not the trivial claim that if you let in more people into your country, you'll have higher population and you'll make more stuff. This is the interesting claim that if you move people from where they are now to where they want to go, the total production of the world will increase by an enormous amount. Why would this be? Essentially, right now, most people on Earth are trapped in places where they cannot realize their full potential or anything close to it. So if you know anyone who has come from a third world country to London, and think about what they were able to accomplish in their home country versus what they were able to accomplish here. You can also think about what could you accomplish in Haiti? What could you actually contribute to the world economy while living in Haiti? You might be able to think of something, but it would be hard. It would be hard to operate at the same level of productivity that you have here. Right? I like to think about there being 1 million farmers trapped in Antarctica. Right? They're farming the snow in extremely inhospitable conditions. What would happen if they were allowed to leave? Obviously, the Antarcticans would be better off, but it would not just be them. They would move to a more hospitable climate. The food production would greatly increase. And what will they do with all the extra food? They're not going to eat it themselves. They're going to sell it on the world market. So the production of the living standards of not just the Antarcticans, but the world rise. What would this even look like? Is it even possible to imagine a doubling of global output? Well, we have some countries where output has more than doubled in recent decades. So we can take a look at China and India, where, while we don't think of it this way, it was really a migration-fueled growth, starting off with very agricultural societies, very low productivity. You wind up getting farm productivity up, and then farmers start moving to the cities because you no longer need nearly as many people to grow food to feed the country, right? And as a result, you have towns, small villages turning into massive cities. So a place that has 100,000 people turning into a city of 5 million people over the course of a couple decades. Is it possible to do it? Of course it's possible. It has been done, right? It is being done right now, even as we speak. Let's see, not hundreds of millions of people today, but as we speak, the typical amount, based upon the arithmetic, is moving from the countryside of India and China into the cities, into the suburbs, and then entering into the global economy. So we should expect that under open borders, rich areas would swell with population, and poor areas would depopulate. Right? In the same way that in the United States, there are large areas of the United States that have fewer people than now than they did 100 years ago. Because there's just not that much to do there in the modern economy. So what do? They leave and go someplace where their talents are valuable. All right, now very simple models of what would happen say this would help first world capital and third world labor and hurt third world capital and first world labor. That is the very basic economic model. But this is on the assumption that there's only one kind of labor, only one kind of capital. Better models recognize that there are many different kinds of labor. Right? And since there are many different kinds of labor, the law of comparative advantage, which I hope you've heard of in some economics class at some point, takes over. Means that we can specialize in trade and thereby increase the total amount of production to the benefit of at least almost everyone. All right, so when empirical researchers factor in these labor differences, they find that even low-skilled native workers rise. The only workers who actually seem to lose materially from immigration are recent immigrants. So who really suffers from immigration? The last immigrants suffer because they are in direct competition. Of course, they also are very often the family members of the new arrivals, so as you might expect, they are positive towards this because there's more to life than just your wages. There's also getting your friends and family out of dire poverty. All right. Furthermore, worth pointing out that labor is not the only asset that is owned by laborers in general. Not sure how widespread home ownership in the UK is, But in the United States, most people own their own home. And again, there's quite a bit of research showing that when immigration increases population area, this increases real estate prices to the benefit of anyone who actually owns a home, right, or will ever inherit that home. Now, people often hear this thing, so this is sort of trickle-down economics. It's in the same flavor as trickle-down economics, but I call it Niagara Falls economics. It's what happens when you double global production. Again, if you think about, well, who lost from the result of the tractor? There you might actually be able to find people, but who lost from the Industrial Revolution overall? Who today would be better off if the last 150 years of progress had not happened? It is very hard to find people like that. So when there's an enormous increase in overall production, then distributional effects are swamped by the overall increase in the total amount of production and the total increase in living standards. All right, further information. So how open borders will change the world. Right, another lesson from the migration-fueled growth in China and India is this massive increase in production is pro-poor. The main gainers from the development of India and China have been the poor Indians and Chinese who have been able to move from their villages, mired in age-old poverty, and enter the modern world and start to enjoy a piece of what people in the first world take for granted. Right now, under open borders, absolutely poor foreigners will move to opportunity, drastically reducing absolute poverty. Right? And again, remember, there is a big difference between the relative poverty when you don't have as good of a smartphone as your friend, and absolute poverty where you were hungry, or where you are stuck out in the rain because you have no place to live. This is the kind of dire poverty which still exists to a substantial extent on Earth, and it is the kind that open borders can cure more rapidly and more surely than any other remedy that is known. This migration will also drastically reduce global inequality, 2/3 of which is actually now between nations. So if you look at inequality in the 19th century, most of it was within each nation. There was not much of a difference in rich nations and poor nations, but within each nation there were large gaps between rich and poor. Now the gaps between rich and poor are smaller than they were within countries in the 19th century, but there are some countries that are fabulously rich, some that are fabulously poor. Under open borders, poor countries would just depopulate, and the poor would move to countries where they are able to use their talents and be part of the global economy. But I don't want to sugarcoat anything. As a professor, I just try to give students the exact truth. So here's the non-sugar-coated fact. Remaining poverty and inequality will be much more visible under open borders, and you will have to live with that. Right? In the same way that right now there would be a simple way that we could alleviate your feelings of pity for the desperately poor of London. So I've walked around, I've seen some homeless people. There is a very simple remedy where you'll never have to see them again. Right? You just go and apply the North Korean solution, say you can't live in London. You're not allowed to be here because you hurt our feelings too much to look at you, and so we're going to feel good about ourselves by not letting you be here to be looked at. That is the North Korean policy. Happily, it is not what you've done. Right? If you, of course, are mainly just concerned about your own feelings of feeling sorry for someone, then this makes perfect sense. Out of sight, out of mind. But on the other hand, if you actually are concerned for the well-being of genuinely poor people, just kicking them out so you don't have to look at them is not any remedy at all. So important point, if my story is 100% correct, I strongly predict that natives will still complain and say that open borders is a complete failure. Based upon we look around, we see poor people, open borders has failed. I'm telling you in advance, expect that to happen. You will see people that by your standards are doing very poorly. Then why did they come? Because it's so much better than what they left behind. Simple point that economists have made many times, but it's very hard for people to absorb on an emotional level. And of course, it's very hard to stop journalists from misleading the world by saying, look, I've taken a picture of a really poor, sad immigrant, so immigration's a failure. Not a failure unless you've also taken a picture of what the person's life was like back in their home. Now, the other effects of open borders are less clear. Right, so here I don't have enough time, and I will say that if I were you getting a 15-minute talk on this, I would not believe me either. All I will tell you is that if you are curious, I will email you and send you citations where you can read it yourself, or of course you can just cut out the middleman and do Google Scholar, right? And you can learn for yourself, right? What does an adequate literature review on these issues actually tell you? Not what journalists say, because journalists, what do? They find the most horrible thing that happened on Earth and they put it on the front page. So I was seeing a medley of covers of British tabloids about horrible things done by immigrants. It's like 37 covers of one tabloid alone in 1 year about how awful immigrants are, each one with a story, right? And I assume the stories are probably basically true. It's just that, well, in a world of, if there are millions of immigrants, how many awful stories should you expect to have every day? I think you could get one every single day. So the fact you've got 37, say, well, actually things are better than they look. But in any case, A quick rundown on other effects of open borders. So budget. At least for the United States, the net effect looks roughly neutral. If that sounds very hard to believe, remember, much spending is what economists call non-rival, where the cost does not vary with population. For example, if there's a baby boom in the United States, no one, even in the United States, will say we need to get more nuclear weapons to protect the new babies. Why? Because we can protect the babies just as well or poorly with the existing stock of nuclear weapons. Right? In the same way, there are many other, so not only national defense, many other kinds of government services are, whether you think they're good or bad, non-rival. They don't cost more to provide to a larger population, which means that when you let in more people, you are spreading the cost over a larger number. Right? So much spending looks non-rival. And furthermore, the rival spending generally focuses on the old rather than the poor. This is true, very true in the United States, but really almost every country that I've seen, government is much more concerned about giving money to every elderly person, regardless of whether they need it, than actually helping poor people. Now, since immigrants tend to be young and poor, this means that actually the amount of money that they're likely to get is not very much. Sometimes people will do a tally of how much immigrants cost taxpayers. They normally conveniently ignore the very biggest thing that government spends money on, which is public education. Right? Because if you get an adult immigrant, you get someone whose education was paid for by their home country and therefore is not paid for, at least very little paid for, by the people of the country to which they are immigrating. All right, then for crime. Actually, crime is likely to go down. Immigrants have lower crime rates than natives. This is definitely true for the United States, except, of course, for immigration-related crimes where natives cannot commit them. I guess you could commit human smuggling, but most immigration crimes cannot legally be committed by natives, so immigrants do poorly there. But otherwise, immigrants are actually remarkably law-abiding. So the line I like to say is, if you should really be afraid of anyone, be afraid of being around native-born Americans, not immigrants. The immigrants are safer. Then politics. So this is one where I know the US data. So it is true that in the United States, the foreign-born are more socially conservative and more economically liberal in the American sense. So more socially right-wing, more economically left-wing. Right? So both things of which I am upset by. But in the immigrant's defense, the gap is modest. It's not a night and day gap. It is not that the typical American is an anarcho-capitalist and the typical immigrant is a Stalinist. It is a marginal difference, which people then are very prone to blow out of proportion and say, so you admit it. I admit it's a small difference. Yes, I do admit that. The gap is modest, and another key point in favor of immigrants is they don't vote very often. So if you think that they vote poorly, at least you'd be happy that they vote rarely. In the United States, at least, many people make both complaints, which again seems to me to be the most blatant of all contradictions. Look, if you think they vote badly, you should be happy they don't vote. But people are often happy to complain in whatever way they can. Right now, in any case, the effects on production / poverty / inequality are so massive that they offset even fairly dire outcomes on other margins. Even if all these other things were quite bad, when you take a look at how much the production of the world would increase, how much human misery would be averted, how much the wasted talents of the world would be able to actually realize themselves and contribute to the global economy. I really don't think that is a hard question in any sense except convincing people. And if you've got ideas on that, I would like to have them. Thank you.